Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event in the Climate and Clean Energy Lecture Series here at Cal Poly Humboldt. Since 2005, the Schatz Energy Research Center has been hosting interdisciplinary lectures like this one to stimulate collaboration and sharing of ideas around issues related to energy, the environment, and society. I'd like to open by noting that we're hosting this webinar session from within the unceded ancestral territory of the Wiyot people. Especially given the topic of today's presentation, I'd like to particularly recognize the fact that Indigenous communities are some of the first and hardest hit by the effects of climate change, and to express my appreciation for the important role that tribal governments and people are continuing to play in shaping a climate resilient future for our region. A couple of housekeeping points before we dive in. If you have any technical challenges, you can post into the chat box and we'll try to help you resolve the problem. There are several of us able to access that chat and we can troubleshoot for you. This evening's talk is also being recorded and it'll be available online later this month on the Schatz Center's YouTube channel and at schatzcenter.org/speakers. And we'll drop the link into the chat if you'd like to access that. This evening's presentation is going to be followed by a Q&A session, a discussion that will be moderated by my colleague, Jen Marlowe. And if you'd like to ask a question, we ask that you not do so in the chat, but instead using the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This will allow us to track questions and to moderate that discussion effectively. You can drop questions into that Q&A box at any time during the presentation, although we're going to save the Q&A session to the end of the evening. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Jola Ajibade, is an associate professor of geography at Portland State University. Dr. Ajibade studies the intersections of climate risk, urban disasters, resilience, planning, coastal management, and societal transformations. Her work centers justice in conversations around climate displacement. She also questions how utopian responses may further exclusionary planning and practices that further marginalize the disadvantaged. Her scholarship advances ideas about just urban adaptation through embracing feminist, decolonial, and anti-racist approaches to envision a more just, livable, and transformative future. I don't want to take up any more of Jola's time singing her praises, so instead, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jola Ajibade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I really want to thank the organizers of this event. I want to thank Jen, everyone working behind the scene. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you to the audience. You know, it's evening and you're able to make it. So thank you for your time. And so today, what I want to share with you, it really brings together a range of the work that I've been doing in the coastal adaptation space. And it's really this idea of should we float or should we retreat from the coast, and who is in fact floating, if you could call it that way, and who is retreating. So that's something I want to share with you, some of my work around this area. Before I do that, one thing I want to just point out to folks is that, you know, the folks working on retreat and the folks working on floating cities are not the same group. In fact, there are different schools of thought. The folks working on the floating cities involves architects and government politicians, engineers. So it's really very technical in some ways. And then the folks working on retreat, you find a lot of community-based organization, governments, also adaptation planners, and they're not necessarily talking to each other. The floating cities people, even though we're all trying to address the issue of sea level rise, and those talking about retreats, they haven't come together to even have a conversation. Those school of thought are different. And then the ways in which they also frame the problem, right? So a lot of people in the managed retreats and even the migration literature have define this age we're in as the age of migration because of climate change. And in some ways, that's very true. We're seeing that happen. While those in the floating group are saying it's the century of the ocean, which is like, we have to take advantage of, everything the ocean can offer us. And I'm going to try to bring this together, but also untangle some of, the ways in which this is playing out on ground. And there is also the justice dimension to this issue, whether we're talking about retreat or we're talking about floating cities. How do we conceptualize justice for whom, and justice in what ways? and the ways in which both types of adaptation have been implemented. Are they truly going to be sustainable for people? Are they going to be equitable? And do they take into consideration, the impacts on future generations, not just our own generation? So I'm going to try to speak to all of those issues. And I typically like to share some few take-home messages before I go deep into my talk itself. And this take-home message just synthesizes my own thoughts around this issue. I'm sure after this presentation, everybody will have their opinion about what's going on, but I'm just synthesizing what I feel are the major takeaways. One key issue is that we already know this. This is not new to any of you, I would assume, that climate change is undermining the capabilities of low-income groups, of marginalized groups, whether you're thinking about their access to livelihood, issues of food security, health, land ties, or even, indigenous knowledge, right? All of those things are being threatened in multiple ways by climate change. So that's one issue. The other issue is that certain climate solutions that we're also trying to implement, particularly around the coast, these solutions are shifting the rights and the regimes of rights and capabilities and opportunities that is available to different groups. So sort of moving some of those rights and capabilities to some group, giving them better, stronger agency, while others have fewer agency, as you would see, to shape the future and to shape their own environment. The third take-home message is that, floating climatopias, which is really what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to sort of break down what I mean by climatopia, in the course of this talk. So floating climatopias, the key message is that they are accelerating the frontiers of coastal capitalism, as you would see. And these climatopias are not the same. I'll show you the three different buckets that I see where these types of cities are being planned. But the key issue for me is also that I see them as a resilience fix, right? It's sort of like a Band-Aid on the problems we're facing without really addressing the solution. But while it's not just a Band-Aid, it's also a Band-Aid that is transferring capital through different means and for the expansion of capital in the hands of some groups of people. And then the fourth thing is that, we do need a scientific assessment of the viabilities of the city. I'm not necessarily for or against any adaptation plan, but the point is, are they really going to be viable in the long run? And we also need new global guidelines on their implementation. Right now, they are being implemented haphazardly in different spaces and supported by different groups. There is no regulations around how you would do floating city and where. And so it might be helpful for us to have some guidelines globally on where we should be doing this, particularly when those types of cities are being built or implemented on waters that is, shared waters between different countries. And the fifth key message for us to think about is, rather than turning the sea into land, which is what we're trying to do with this whole floating climatopias, as you would see, can we actually think of living more sustainably on land? So this is just my own thoughts around this issue. So I'll go deep a little bit. So when we're thinking about the issue of floating climatopias, particularly, or floating cities more broadly, there are credits, or should I say, there are validity to the ways in which people are justifying the city. And it makes sense in some ways. Where you think about some cities, they are not only experiencing increase in sea level rise, but they are also, increase in sea level, but they're also sinking. So there are a number of cities across the world, whether you're thinking about Chittagong in Bangladesh, or Yangon in Myanmar, or Jakarta, for instance, or even Lagos, where I come from, or Manila, right? There are parts of these cities that are not only exposed to sea level rise, but they are also sinking. So those issues have been there and it's been documented in the literature about cities experiencing these two things. And this is an image of Jakarta showing, how the city is not only experiencing sea level, but also sinking. And it's really one of the fastest sinking city in the world. So these challenges are real. And also this is an image of a mosque in Jakarta that it was above water in 1980s, and it's literally sunk, or it has sunk, as you can see, as of today. So you can see that those things are really a struggle. And the idea of floating cities are not completely out of order if you think about the intersection of sea level rise and land subsidence. And here in the US, there's also this documentation, as you can, I hope this image is clear to people, where even though these things are happening, it's not the case that people are necessarily moving away from the coast. These source here from Tennessee Data Center exploring the decline in population between 2010 and 2020, you can see there are areas where there is some decline in population along the Gulf Coast, but there are a lot of areas where there's a lot of people still moving in there. So the issue of sea level rise or concerns around coastal flooding has not necessarily meant that everybody's leaving the coast. People are still moving there and still living there. So those are things to keep in our mind. And in terms of future projections, this work from Culp and Strauss, they actually talk about the fact that many areas of the world are going to experience sea level rise, but also more importantly, what they point out in that literature is that we may see close to 630 million people being displaced globally. Some other literature talk about close to 1 million. Depending on who you're reading, the numbers could change. And when you think about even the IPCC report in 2021, this figure is from the IPCC, whether we're looking at the shared socio-economic pathway level 1 between 1 and 1.9, or even if we go on, a runaway climate change where we continue business as usual, the situation obviously it's much more there. But even under a scenario where we try to contain our emissions, we try to change our economic system to live within the Earth carrying capacity, we're still likely to see an increase in sea level rise. So it is an issue, and we do need to find ways that people can adapt. So these are valid challenges. And the work from Culp and Strauss actually shows that in previous projections, there are areas where, for instance, this is from their work particularly, you can see Alexandria in 2050, this was the old projection that this part of Alexandria will be underwater, but with their own recent analysis, they actually found that a larger portion of Alexandria in Egypt could be underwater. Same for Bangkok, same for Shanghai, same for Ho Chi Minh. All of these new reports that they published in 2019 actually shows there are many parts of the world that could be experiencing a higher level of sea level rise and inundation. And so there are spaces for all kinds of, there are different solution spaces and different kinds of solutions we can think for cities that are experiencing this issue. This is work from my colleague, Mark and Siders. And here they, outline different options that we have. So one which includes resisting, it's essentially just building seawalls, another trying to accommodate the water, another avoiding the situation, or retreat, or we advance where we build floating cities. So the key thing I'm focusing on today is both retreat and the floating option. But I'll focus more on the floating side of things because I've given a lot of talk on the retreat aspect. So when it comes to the issue of retreat or float, the questions that often come to my mind is who is moving away from those places and who is staying? And that really, speaks to the issue of equity as well, right? In a paper that I published, which is a paper that, spells out not just the challenges that we're experiencing in the climate change space, but also the fact that even when you're thinking about retreat and migration, they are not necessarily the same. There are people migrating on their own, and there are people retreating in the sense that they are relocating with the support of government or with support of nonprofit organizations or using their own funding. And so in that paper where I differentiated between climate migration and managed retreat, I actually talked about that the funding sources, I talked about the differences between those types of mobilities, but also the struggles that people using either of these mobilities face. For instance, with climate migration, there is no legal protection internationally. Even the very word climate-induced migrants are not something that has been acknowledged internationally. There is no protection of property rights for people when they migrate on their own. There is often, this idea of migrants being seen as a problem. And so in many Western countries, you've found situations where the idea of climate migration or even migrants has been weaponized as a rationale to build border walls, right? To keep people away, to create all sort of protectionist plans. And then on the other side is the managed retreat, which happens internally, but also could happen internationally. And in some of those cases, you would see where people get support to move from areas that are experiencing severe impacts of flooding, or in some cases, even wildfires, and people relocating to a relatively safer area. So in that paper, I documented the struggles that people could face, whether you use managed retreat or use climate migration. There are different challenges. There are people who like to retreat who cannot do so. They are trapped in place. There are people who retreat, but even after retreating, they also face new hazard in the new place they move to, or they face new livelihood risks where they don't have access to food and other forms of livelihood or jobs. And there are people, when they migrate, they feel trapped in refugee camps or trapped in transition where they cannot get to the new country. They're also not in a refugee camp. And so there are all of these problems with even moving in response to climate change. And then there are other things we might think about, issues of, loss of identity for people, loss of ancestral site from where they are moving from, loss of attachment to place. So there are a lot of challenges with this option, but there are also a few success, let me put it that way. So in another paper, and this paper was inspired by journalists who had reached out to me and said, you've written, a couple of papers on retreat and the problems with retreat, whatnot. I had the examples of successful relocation that we could speak to. And then I did tons of research to find out with a number of my students, and we were able to identify there are different ways we might conceptualize what a successful relocation is. It's not the same for every community or even every country. And I'm just showing this very briefly because I want to center my talk on the floating cities issue. But in that paper, I documented there are a number of ongoing projects where we couldn't determine whether they were successful or not. And there were a number of unsuccessful projects because people were pushed out of, in some cases, in fact, possibly removed from where they were living and pushed elsewhere. And so we called that kick out rather than, managed retreat. And there were a number of projects that were compensatory. Here in the US, there's a lot of buyouts happening. And so the buyout type of relocation or retreat is what we called compensatory relocation. And that also happens in Europe. We documented that. And then there were a few that they were eco-restorative, a few that were also transformative, and some that were reformative. So I encourage people to read that. I've given a lot of talks on this issue, so that's why I'm not going too deep, but I'm happy to answer questions about this retreat side of things. But what I really want to focus on a lot is this futurist institute adaptation, which I call climatopias, where people don't move, where they choose to stay, and which chooses to stay is really what I want to focus on. So climatopias, just by a simple definition, these are utopian architectures that are distinctive for their climate mitigation and adaptation aspirations. They often have grand designs. Not all of them do, but some do have this grand, almost very, magnificent designs, let me put it that way. They would have smart technology powering them. The goal is that they would also have renewable energy as a source of their energy. They are often very designed to be a luxury style living. And there are claims that these types of projects can accommodate 10,000, some of them say 10,000 people. Some could accommodate 250,000 people when it's completed. And the argument is that these types of projects can reduce the pressure on land by increasing the real estate markets on the ocean. So often, calling on the ocean as like the solution space for dealing with these types of issues. And so I just want to remind us, there are a lot of discourses out there about climatopias, but the top ones I think are interesting in some ways. The first thing you hear people building these types of projects, like, climate change is causing sea level rise and threatening low-lying communities and cities. We got to do something. And so that's one of the key discourses around why we need these types of solution. And then the other argument you also hear is that, we can't keep relocating people. We need to tackle the problems heads on. We need to stay here and do something about it. So relocation is often not a conversation for people working in the space. And then the other argument is that floating cities, are sustainably designed cities, and they are going to address not only the risk part of exposure to climate change, they're going to be energy efficient, and they're going to be essentially what I see as an escape bunkers from climate change. While everyone else is dealing with it, you can actually hide out in this sustainable city and pretend climate change is not happening. Maybe I'm being sarcastic, but kind of, the old way it's been talked about is very utopian in that sense. And then there is also this idea that, this floating structures is really going to help the communities at risk. The idea that we have failed on land and that we cannot succeed on the sea is sort of what is being used to push for some of these projects. And, even though I'm going to be speaking to the real estate aspects of this conversation, but we also know that it's not only the floating cities that is sort of using this language of, the sea being a place where we can find solutions, right? We've ascribed to the ocean this messianic or almost a savior role to help fix the problems that we've caused or that has been caused through our industrial revolution, through our land use policies. And now we have to go to the ocean to kind of fix things. And so this narrative is also very much evidence if you think about the ocean being the next frontier for energy transition, right? So there are people obviously working in these spaces looking at, how to do offshore solar panels in a way that is sustainable, how to do wind panels offshore that is sustainable, all of those arguments, those things are happening, But on this side, I'm focusing more on the real estate expansion on the ocean and this whole idea of the ocean being the savior that we can look to. And so in line with that, you see a lot of newspaper reports going back to that discourses, right? Are this thing a possibility or visibility? And people saying, floating cities, the next big real estate boom, that it's an unsinkable idea. And then the UN obviously has jumped in on this idea. They have also supported the first, they call it the first prototype floating city that's OceanX in Busan in South Korea. And this was announced in April 2022. And then there is the Maldives, again, claiming to be first floating city that will be built in Male, and that will be completed in 2027. So there are all of this interesting discusses how they're about the city. And so what I do question in my own work is who are the planners and funders of these floating cities? And also, who belongs to this city and who doesn't belong in these types of cities? Those are very open questions, open-ended questions that we are yet to fully see, especially for the floating types. And then whose vision is being silenced or amplified through these types of designs that we're seeing in those three types of cities? And are they truly a form of adaptation, which is sort of the grounding arguments that are going to be an adaptive option for people, and they can also help with climate mitigation? That's the argument. But, are they an adaptation or a maladaptation option? And when you think about the whole argument around the sustainability side of it, the question I think about is, where are they sourcing the materials of this project from? Because that's really the root cause. If you want to know if something is sustainable, you need to think about from the production to the use to the disposal. Are the materials they're using itself truly sustainable? And where are they being sourced from? Are they being sourced from countries where there is a lot of conflicts and countries where we can't even pay people a decent amount of living? And when the materials are no longer useful, are they going to be disposed? Where are they going to be disposed, essentially? So those are key things to keep in mind. And then the other question also is that, are this project a safe haven for climate refugees? Because that's part of the narrative around these types of projects. Or are they going to create new climate refugees themselves if it is an hurricane, for instance, or a major typhoon that affect any of the floating cities? Do we then have to retreat people because of those types of instances? So there is this issue of, are they truly a safe haven for future or current climate refugees? And what are the impacts of these cities on biodiversity, of the ocean, of coral reefs or fisheries and other sources or other species living in the ocean? And what about the future generation? Will they be living on the city? So these are things to keep in mind. And for me, as I think through those questions, one key issue that comes to my mind for me is this idea of capability justice, right? I already mentioned earlier that climate change is challenging the capabilities of different groups of people, particularly low income and marginalized groups. And that these types of, that are certain solutions that also affects people's capability. So not just climate change itself. And so when we think about the idea of capability justice, we can trace it back to this whole issue of capability approach, which began from the work of Amartya Sen and was further improved by Martha Nussbaum. And the idea of the capability approach is basically idea of expanding people's freedom and choices to be able to achieve the kind of life they value. So achieving their basic functioning, achieving their well-being. And we know that climate change is already threatening people's well-being. But are the solutions that we're implementing allowing people to achieve their own well-being, or are those solutions expanding the capability of particular groups and restricting the capability of other people? So the question becomes, who has the freedom to implement those types of adaptation and to benefit from those types of adaptation, and who may be losing out from those types of adaptation, and who is being deprived, of their own freedom when we implement these types of adaptation. So those are things that I've been thinking about. And then in a different, entirely different paper, this idea around justice, I looked at it from a slightly different perspective when I'm thinking about these ideas around resilience fix, where some of the solutions that we implement to address climate change essentially allows for the transfer of capital. Or by that, I mean, allow us to metabolize land and energy and water and, labor and turn them into ownable and tradable commodities, which is essentially is what we're seeing with the ocean, right? Where these types of projects allows us to be able to bring energy, to bring land, to bring labor together, to bring all kinds of resources together, to actually turn it to a commodity that people trying to shield themselves from climate change can actually buy into. So for me, these two sort of theoretical framing are the ways in which I'm looking at, the idea of the floating city and who is able to live there, and the idea of capability justice, whose capability is restricted and whose capability is being advanced by these types of projects. And I wouldn't go into details about the whole circular thing, but that's really just the core of the arguments that I'm trying to advance in that paper around resilience fix. And so to explain to folks the kinds of coastal climatopias that are out there, there are three different ones that I see from my perspective. There is a land reclamation-based climatopias. There are lots of those, and I'll show you some examples. There are amphibious climatopias, which may not be bad, quite frankly, maybe a great idea, and I will tell you why I think it might be a good idea. And then there are the floating climatopias that are actually essentially floaters, right? So the reclamation climatopias, there are a lot of struggles around them because they essentially replicate some of the types of building designs that we've had in the 1980s, but just making it better in a way that, implementing utopian ideas around them. So before I dig a little deeper into these three different types of climatopias, I also want to mention that there are arguments in the literature around what are the barriers to implementing any of this projects, right? And so there are arguments around, are they visible? Would they really meet the so-called designs and sustainability goals that they claim they will be doing? And what is the cost? What is the benefits? Who is bearing the cost? Are they too expensive? Should we invest in our adaptation dollars elsewhere? And does it really benefit a lot of people? If 10,000 people are going to be living in the floating city in Maldives, is that enough? Should we be thinking of other kinds of adaptation that allows us to accommodate more people, right? There is also the argument about the legal status of these types of projects, right? So under what regulations would this project align with? Would they be controlled by the country where they are built, or would they be an entirely different legal status? And also the other issue is, who should be a citizen in those places, right? So it becomes an open question. Is it the regular folks from Maldives or from South Korea, the examples that I've showed earlier, or would it be, anyone from anywhere in the world? And then what are the ecological impacts? And then what are suddenly the equity issues that are a lot more open to questions, especially when you're thinking about these types of projects being a potential climate haven for the wealthy, or a second home, or a vacation investment for the wealthy. So there are all kinds of arguments around whether or not this project should be done, but they are being done anyways. And so when it comes to visibility, I do want to say it is very visible. I don't see that as a big issue. And you can look back in time and say that the idea of living with on the ocean or on the bay or with water or river is not new. You know, these has existed, and it's not a Dutch invention. I really wanted to say that. It dates back to about 700 AD with the Tang dynasty in China, where fishermen relocated to living on the boats to avoid wars on mainland. So we've seen this. We've also seen places like Lake Titicaca in Peru in the 14th century, where people were living on the ocean, on water, so it's not new. And there are floating homes, example also in Thailand. There are floating hotels in Thailand as well. So all the idea of living water is not new. And there are also low-income groups that live in water, or live on water rather. In Cambodia, we've seen examples of people who were living in water. And where I come from in Lagos as well, the examples of, you know, people living on stilts, floating storm in Lagos. This is Makoko, Lagos. And a lot of this example, particularly people who live in these locations, it's really shows in many ways, while these types of locations are challenging to live in, it also shows the resilience and the ingenuity of people trying to adapt to the environment, to live under very severe conditions with poverty, but also trying to live in situations with ecological constraints. So the idea that are we able to live on water is, I don't think it's a big deal. I think it's happening. As you can see, it's been happening for so long. And then this example is also an example from Lagos, where a floating school was built in 2016 as a prototype where students could go to school, who were living on the Makoko water at lagoon. But the sad thing is that this did come down after a heavy storm. So that there was an end to that. But the fact that it can be done, we've seen that. And there are challenges in terms of the design. And then if you think about some of the modern designs of floating homes as well, there are tons of examples of, you know, houses built by the water in Amsterdam. It's not new. And also the idea of expanding, making room for the river is, you know, is something that the Dutch has always done and certainly continue to advance. So we've seen this. So it's the issue of the feasibility of it is, I don't think I'm too worried. I think humans can do that. And they've been doing it for a while. But there are other issues that remains very open to questioning. So I'm going to dig a little bit into them. So when we think about the reclamation-based climatopias, there are a few that I can speak to based on my own research, but a recent paper came out that actually shows that so many coastal reclamation happening. And a lot of some of those projects are actually in East Asia as well, some in China. So we're seeing, even as sea level rise is happening, we're also seeing a lot of reclaimed land along the ocean. So that's something to keep in mind. And they're happening all over the world. In fact, in this paper, they documented that out of 135 cities that were explored, 106 cities, they noticed that land reclamation was going on by the coast. So that's something. And in the places that where I work, particularly in Lagos, we're seeing this land reclamation-based mega development project, which I call climatopias, the Eco-Atlantic City being one, and Orange Island also being built, Gracefield Island being built. And in Manila as well, where I do some work as well, there is also the proposal to build this Manila City of Pearl. And all of this land or reclamation-based projects, some of the challenges is that they follow a pattern of dispossession where people who are living in those areas are forcibly moved, and then these types of projects continue. They also allow for the destruction of wetlands that could act as a natural carbon sink. And many of them are also built to attract transnational elites, you know, to purchase these new homes in these spaces on the coast. And as just to show you an example here in Lagos, you know, as those projects are being constructed, you see the evictions that happen are actually violent eviction in some cases where people's homes are bulldozed just to make this construction happen. And here, I hope people can see this, where there's so many constructions going on along the coast of Lagos. This is the Eco-Atlantic I showed you, and there are several others as well. And then similarly, I work in Manila, and I've documented it in some of my research as well. There are a number of projects that have been proposed to be built along the coast. They're all land reclamation-based climatopias, and some of them are being approved already. You can see the yellow ones that are approved. And the interesting thing with Manila is there are other research that have been done to actually document that these areas where some of these projects have been built are also areas that are prone to flooding. And in a paper, this is a paper I wrote about planned retreat, where I talked about the environmental justice side of this challenge, where as retreat is happening in Lagos and in Manila, in this case, some of those areas where people are being forced to relocate or violently removed, there are also areas where this land or new urban reclamation projects, these climatopias, are happening. So anyone interested could check out that paper to see what's going on there. So moving back to whether those, the cost of the project, definitely they are mostly always very expensive. The Lagos one was meant to cost 6 billion. I imagine they might have even spent more. And another one, and this, a lot of people may be aware of this one that has happened in Dubai, this reclaiming land or creating this special island. And it's tons of money to do this. The question becomes, is it worth it in the long run, and what are the benefits? I'm just going to show a 1-minute video so people can make up their minds about the benefits.
Ago, Dubai was a sweltering desert, but in the past 20 years, Dubai has revolutionized itself into the 20th century and become the #1 luxury tourist destination in the entire world. To forming their own man-made islands, to constructing the tallest building in the world, Dubai has it all. But with great success comes an array of downfalls. 20 years after Dubai's Palm Island was constructed, it's beginning to sink back into the ocean. With a whopping $12 billion thrown into the project, this is a serious problem for Dubai and could prove catastrophic for everyone involved in creating these man-made islands. Way back in 2000.
So I encourage people interested to check out that video, but you can see that after spending 12 billion to build a project, it's sinking back into the water. And so some of this project, the goal is that it will not sink, but there is no evidence that they are not sinking, at least from the Dubai example. So that's something to keep in mind. So moving on to the amphibious. I'm good on time, right, Kevin? Okay, thank you. So for the amphibious projects, which I'm a little bit sympathetic to this one, in part because they may not have too many problem with the environment. And so these types of climatopias are slightly different in the sense that it's not about building new reclaimed land on the ocean, reclaimed houses on the ocean. It's not about essentially moving everybody into ocean. It's about living in areas where if people are already living there and it's an area that gets flooded, and they can rebuild the house or retrofit the house in ways that the house would get lifted up when there is flooding, and then when the water subsides, homes get back to their position. And so these types of amphibious projects are also being proposed. And in fact, they're being proposed, I think, for Louisiana to be able to deal with flooding. But there hasn't been a lot of support for them because, retrofitting homes for people who may be low-income groups is going to cost a lot of money, and there hasn't been a lot of investment here. But this, I think, may have a lot of promise if we're not trying to move people elsewhere, but trying to help them adapt where they are. So that's one example. And then in terms of there are other examples of, that amphibious project. Again, not surprisingly, in the Dutch, Maasbommel in Netherlands. And so you can see here, this is slightly on the ocean, but these buildings are meant to rise and then drop down if there is a higher tide. So in some ways, this may not cost too much money, and maybe a few people may be able to afford it. And then there is the floating climatopias, where essentially it's building on the ocean. It's not just keeping people where they are or reclaiming land. It's really moving to the ocean. And so the two examples that I'm aware of, one is the Maldives, which is under construction. And for those who may not know about the Maldives, it's an archipelago of about 1,000 low-lying islands. It's one of the most vulnerable nations in the world to climate change. 80% of the land area is less than 1 meter above sea level rise, above sea level. And so the area is expected to experience close to 1 meter sea level rise by the end of the century. So there are serious concerns here. The initial conversations or discourse in Maldives was to relocate people elsewhere. But now with this whole idea of floating cities, the goal is that maybe some people can stay, that maybe you don't have to relocate everybody. However, there are challenges, right? This project, for instance, is being sponsored by a public-private partnership between the Dutch Dockland Company and the government of Maldives. And they brought in different architects and also engineers to help with this project. The project is expected to cost about $1 billion. And they said, each of the housing would maybe cost about $250,000 to $700,000 for each unit. And the argument is that they would have units for low-income groups. I'm not sure a low-income person, can afford $250,000 or $700,000 home, but we'll see. Time will tell how this will play out. And the goal is that this would accommodate up to 10,000 people. And then there is also the Busan, Oceanics Busan, which is supported by the United UN Habitat Program. And again, the argument is that there will be about 10,000 people who live here initially, and that as they expand out, you may have up to 100,000 people. They are planning to build about 75 acres of area for people to live here. It's going to be self-sustaining. It would have solar energy. People will be able to produce their food, manage water effectively. Also, this could cost about 200 to 700 million. So there are all of these arguments about, why this might be a good prototype. And this one is said to be a bit experimental. So we'll see how it plays out when it's completed. And this would be sort of like, the lower section. If you want to scuba dive, this is what people can experience if you're living in that Busan area. And there is the other one that is also being proposed. This is by the government of Saudi Arabia. They want to build this octagonal floating city. And the interesting thing, which is why I added it to my presentation today, is that they are trying to combine both a land reclamation aspect with a floating aspect to create this octagon city. And so it's going to have about 90,000 people would live here. They're going to create jobs. This is the story. And that, they're going to have this, a trade. Obviously, the Suez Canal, there's a lot of trading that happens there, and that it's going to continue to boost trade and boost tourism. And it will have clean energy. And so there will be people who live on the reclaimed side, and there will be people who live on the floating side. So that's sort of the arguments. And this is also been proposed, and see how it goes. This is just another image of what it would look like. So really interesting and fascinating images here. And a lot of people, because this is California, I know people might be aware of this, that is proposed by the Seasteading Institute. This is a rendering of artificial floating land in French Polynesia that has been proposed. I don't think this is ongoing yet. I think it's just an image, but we'll see what time will tell. And so for me, a key issue as you look at all of these different projects, particularly the reclamation-based climatopias and the floating climatopias, the question becomes, are these truly an opportunity for adapting, or are they really a possible elite capture of both the land and the sea? And, time will tell, but the indications from at least some of the projects that I'm aware of in Lagos and in Manila, they are not essentially built for the poor. So a lot of those land reclamation zones, people cannot afford them. And so when we think about the equity issues, comparing this cost to the reality on ground, reality, in my opinion, I'm open to being corrected, it seemed more to me like another, ocean colonialism, not just the capitalist side, but we're now as humans trying to colonize the ocean. And, and this may also create some new forms of enclosure that some people are already taking advantage of for those who can afford to live there. And obviously, not only are these projects expensive themselves and the people who can afford them, also the land areas that may be surrounding some of this housing are likely to increase. So land values in those areas may increase, and this may also lead to gentrification for those who may be living there, where the lowest or the poorest may be forced to move out. So low-income groups may be forced to move out of those areas. And then also it could increase urbanization, particularly the reclamation-based climatopias. We are already seeing that in Lagos, and we're likely to see it in many other places where it could increase urbanization in flood-prone areas. There are concerns around pollution from plastics and other human activities. We're not necessarily living on the ocean yet as in high numbers, and we've seen so many plastic pollution. And so imagine if a lot of us are now living on the ocean, what is likely to happen when it comes to polluting the ocean from our own activities. And then it's important to think about not just the human dimensions of the equity issue, but also the non-human dimensions as well. And so when we're thinking about the non-human impacts, what are the impacts are these types of cities and real estate advancement on the ocean? What impact is going to have on marine lives, on coral reefs? What environmental footprints are we going to have in the long term? And this project, especially the reclamation-based one, they are likely to create a path dependency in the long term. It might be difficult to undo something that you spent $12 billion putting together. It could be very hard to undo it over time. And another issue that I've just been thinking about is also the gender dimensions of this. When I look at a lot of the people involved in the design of this project, especially the architects, most of them are men. I'm not saying men, and I think men are okay, great, they're good. But I wonder if it was a more participatory approach where different perspectives, women are involved in the design of this project, communities are involved, indigenous groups are involved. What are we likely to come up with when it comes to solutions on how we might live on the coast? Are we likely to see this? Most of the projects are championed by men, and I see this as a male gaze of how we can deal with the sea level rise or even land subsidence. Are there other ways that when we bring different perspectives together, what are the other solutions that we may come up with? And just to wrap up here, for me, I'm thinking, how are we fixing, what are we fixing? Are we addressing the symptoms when we're thinking about this sea level rise challenges and coastal adaptation issue? Or should we be really thinking about, the core work we need to do to reduce our emission, the core work we need to do to scale down our footprints on Earth, rather than advancing into the ocean? These are just my thoughts, but, happy to take questions. And to go back to my initial take-home message, right? So I've mentioned that floating climatopias are shifting the regimes of rights and capabilities and opportunities available to different groups, and that these types of projects are accelerating coastal capitalism, but also ocean colonialism, as we can see. We do need a scientific assessment of whether or not we should be doing this, and we need a global guideline for their implementation. And lastly, I would say, do we really need to turn the sea into land, or can we live sustainably on land? Thank you very much for listening, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Jola. What a wild tour of the world to see all those places and historic floating cities and renderings of concepts of floating cities and all of the shifts in thinking around how to fix the problem. It's a fascinating dive into the ocean of the minds of humans that don't know what to do about a lot of these problems, and those that think they know what to do and forget that we have one question, which is, as innovative as these floating cities seem, aren't they doubling down on the climate risk of coastal areas? Who wants to ride out a storm surge in one of those artificial islands? It seems like that question is somehow forgotten. Is it just a convenient forgetting of the fact that these artificial climatopias don't reduce the risk of living in a coastal area?
Yeah, I think that's a really brilliant question. Yeah, and I asked myself the same question. So depending on the climatopias we're talking about, if you think about and this again is my interpretation of how I've read the materials out there. So if you think about the floating climatopias, I don't see them taking storm surges, especially hurricanes or typhoons, into consideration. It's more about the sea level rise. So avoiding or trying to deal with sea level rise as a way to manage coastal adaptation. But we know that we could get impact from above and from below. And are we building to be able to withstand the impact from above, not just to be able to deal with sea level rise? So the amphibious climatopia, that is something that hasn't, in my opinion, been fully considered, because they are retrofitting existing home to make them to be able to deal with flooding. And so if you think about heavy rains mainly, so that would work. But if you think about hurricane, I don't know, maybe you need to also think about how we need to redesign the structures of the home themselves. Now, when it comes to the reclamation-based climatopias, and I'll speak to the example in Lagos, the argument from the designers, the architects, and the engineers is that that kind of project, especially the Eco Atlanta city, the argument is that they already took storm surges into consideration, and that the city they are building will be able to withstand a storm in 100 years flooding, or 100 years or 500 years flooding. And we know what that means. It's just 1% chance of flooding a year or whatever. So that's the narrative or the discourse you hear. Whether that is true remains to be tested. And if we continue to experience like severe impacts, especially with hurricanes or typhoons or whatever, I don't know. I don't know if those types of cities will be able to withstand major storms.
Yes, and as Arnie mentioned in the chat here, just also tsunamis. So we have multi-hazard
tsunamis, exactly.
That seem to be foregoing multi-hazard analyses and looking at single hazard floating cities without understanding the multiple risks from multiple hazards concurrently. So one other question related to that is looking at a lot of the slides you shared had governments proposing these new cities. So the octagonal city that you shared was a government proposal. And the question is around the legal justifications behind governments that are approving these types of projects and promoting these types of projects, and questioning what is their justification. So are they justifying these developments based on climate adaptation risk, on economics, on frontier colonialism? Like, what is the justification they're using to attract investors to these boondoggles?
Okay, great question. Again, we have to separate out which ones are government pushed. So and as you know, in Saudi Arabia, it's a very wealthy nation, right? So it's not surprising that the government is on board and also slightly pushing for that, in order to increase their own, not only global attention and turn their country is essentially in many ways global, but also getting investors to come in and invest. So it's not surprising in the case of Saudi Arabia that that's happening. And also, obviously, there's a competition between what's going on in Saudi Arabia and Dubai, and every nation wants to be the first. So there is that innate, there's that obvious competition. And to the question about, are they all trying to address climate change? That is part of the underlying consideration for some of these projects. But I would say the Saudi Arabia one, a lot of the things I found is largely economic side of it and the tourism argument. Whereas the one for South Korea, where you have the Oceanic Busan, is the climate change arguments you hear a lot, and the sea level rise arguments. Same with the Maldives floating city, the arguments about, we're sinking, we have problems with sea level rise, we need to adapt, or otherwise we may be inundated in the long run. So that's a very clear climate change argument. The one in Lagos as well has a very strong climate change argument, same in Manila. So depending on where the project is happening, there are all this undertone of climate change in order to get a lot of justification and support from the public is part of it. And then when it comes to who is implementing, sometimes you find that the proposers, the people who initiate this project, typically, in some cases, it comes from the architects themselves. Like Bjork, I forgot his last name, the guy trying to build the Oceanex Busan. He's an architect, very popular guy, and the one working on Maldives, they're all popular, and they're like, oh, we need to reimagine how we live with water. And so these ideas come from them, and they get meetings with the UN or with the government of the country. They convince the government of the country that this is what we should be doing, and then the government buys into it. In the case of Lagos, the story, I wrote a paper about this. It's actually where the governor of Lagos State at the time, Governor Bola Tinubu, who is now the president of Nigeria, or the president-elect, went to Dubai and said, oh, how beautiful all of this Dubai island is. We should just do something similar in Lagos. And that's how the old Lagos thing was initiated. It was by the state government. So depending on the project, there are different conglomeration of actors that come together. And the initiators sometimes are the architects, sometimes are, businesses, and sometimes at the government. But oftentimes when the implementation begins, you see all of these different interests merged together, but you also see a lot of issues around, capital at the end of the day, the economic benefits being proposed to investors and the climate story being told to local communities that, this is going to help you guys as well.
It just frames a question for me, which is, how do you see the difference between this and, say, SpaceX? What Elon Musk is doing? Is there any difference between
this going to space?
Yeah, just all these architects that are pushing these agendas subsidized by the governments. It just strikes me as a similar fact pattern, but I'm wondering, is there a meaningful distinction between adventures to colonize space and these ocean colonization projects?
Yeah, really great question. Oh my God. I think it would take years for us to live in space. I think we have many years to get there. But you do ask a really important question, which I think goes back to why I was centering this idea around capability justice as a framing for this kind of work, because it comes down to who has the capability, the resources, the education, to be able to impose and push for their own vision of the world, and who isn't able to do it. And so this idea of living on the ocean, or humans living on Mars or somewhere in space or whatever, it comes down to being wealthy. It comes down to being extremely educated, having the networks. So sometimes you may even be wealthy if you don't have the networks, like those who have the networks to go to the UN and say, oh, now we need to build Ocean X Busan, whatever. You have the connection. So there are so many things that comes together for folks who have a vision of the world they want to see and are able to implement that. And all of us, we kind of have to either buy into it or resist it. So that's happening. And there are other people who have a slightly different vision of, can we downscale? Can we reduce, our emissions? Can we reduce our energy consumption? Rather than expanding and creating luxury lifestyles, can we have just, one car for like 2 families? Or, our transportation system, let it serve everybody, right? Our food system, let it serve everybody. And so there are those different contrasting visions of what we need to do when it comes to adapting to impacts of climate change more broadly. And what other options can allow us to not necessarily change much, but allow technology to enable the same lifestyle we want, and maybe pretend that technology has no impact in the long run. I don't know. I'm being cynical here, but really it comes down to whose vision of the world we have now and whose vision of the world we're going to be living in a few years to come, in part because of this narrative around what we need to do to deal with climate change.
Thank you. There's a couple questions around how to do this, how to implement adaptation, addressing the root of the crisis, climatopias aside. And it made me think about the transformative justice examples in your managed retreat paper. I think there were 2 case studies out of I don't know how 150 or so of your case studies that were transformative justice. Can you maybe profile those? Like how are those projects working, and what set them apart, and why were they so transformative, and what can we learn from those?
Oh, wow. Good question. And I apologize that I didn't dwell too much on that. Yeah, it was really hard for us to even calling them transformative. I think in the paper, we acknowledged that they were not perfect. Any project can transform the world, both positively and negatively. But in that paper, we were using the word transformative to mean a positive transformation that worked for community and that also could work, sustainably with the environment. And what distinguished those projects was multiple things, right? Number one, there was a lot of time invested in planning those retreats. So it wasn't a retreat that happened like immediately after the flood and people were pushed away or something, or people were asked to move. It was something that was in conversation for like, in some cases, 10 years, like the Fiji one, because we had Fiji and Puerto Rico. The Fiji one took years. Communities wanted to relocate. They needed to identify the place they were going to go to. And they also had this multi-level government's involvement in the relocation. They also donated their own labor. in implementing the relocation, where the men that will be living, and women and children, all of the folks that will be living in those places actually were part of the people that built the new houses. So it wasn't something that was built by an external or foreigner. It was something that was built by the locals themselves. And the women in the course of building also learned how to install solar panels. So there was training, skill training, there was educational opportunity that was incorporated into the old retreat approach. And one of the key factors that made us call it transformative was that it also transformed the livelihoods of people. And depending on where you stand, you may say that's challenging or whatever, but it is challenging in the sense that these were communities that were coastal, but they had to relocate from the coast and move inland. And so they had to become agriculturalists. So that was a transformation of their livelihood. But the good side of it, though, is that they do have the opportunity. They didn't move completely far away in areas that, they didn't move to another country or anything like that. They had the opportunity to be able to go back to fish in those places where they left. And so it wasn't a situation where the land was taken away from them. So for instance, for those who may be aware of the IDJC case in Louisiana, where communities have been asked to relocate, and a lot of the indigenous people still want connection back to that areas where they've been asked to relocate. They still want to claim ownership, but the government is saying, if you move, this land is no longer yours, it's now the land that belongs to the government. And so that's a different situation with Fiji, where the people still have access to the land and they could use the land, but they are now living in the relatively safer areas. But even though they moved to that safe area, the area they moved to was experiencing landslide. And so they had to implement mitigation measures to be able to reduce the impact of landslide. So that's what I'm saying, like wherever you go in the world, I would say in the world where we live, you're going to experience one impact of climate change or the other. It comes down to which ones can you manage with certain mitigation and adaptation, and which ones are really severe. So that's and then another problem we identified in the case of the Fiji, even though it was really acclaimed to be successful by a lot of researchers and the people themselves, there were the gender dimensions, where part of the decision-making process involved a lot of the men as opposed to the women. So the women would come into the room, but they were not really effectively involved in the decision-making. So that was an issue. And then another thing we also identified was in terms of labor compensation. Many of the men who were involved in building the housing, the new housing where people relocated to, they were compensated for their labor. But the women who helped with the installation of the solar panel, they were not compensated for their labor. So even though overall the project was successful, there are still some issues that could be improved in a relocation like that. In the case of Puerto Rico, which was the second example, one of the key things that I think stood out for people was the fact that the land where people relocated to was put in a trust, such that people could not be forcibly moved in future, like with issues around gentrification. And that matters a lot. If you know the history of Puerto Rico, where there's a lot of issues with land rights, and there's a lot of issue with energy companies as well. There's tons of problems when we think about U.S. relationship, especially the colonial relationship that we still have in many ways with Puerto Rico. But this community came together, they moved from areas that were experiencing repetitive flooding and identified a location that they wanted to move to, work together to build this new housing, also implemented storm water management in the new housing. And part of the relocation, same here, also involved education of people, community bonds. So they moved as a community, not like individual relocation where you have just buyouts and you give some people money and say you give. So anyways, I don't want to take too much time, but there are so many things that were really very, I think, worthwhile celebrating in those two relocations. And that's why we call them transformative.
Thank you. And I think a counterfactual to that is the question around the fate of indigenous coastal dwellers when these resilience fixes are obviously not economical or in their interest. So what are their rights? What are the realms of their freedoms or their capacities in those instances? Capabilities, I think is your word, sorry.
Yeah, no, but the only words are, and any word you use is also relevant. I think in the case of indigenous communities, because I think we documented a case which we call reformative, and this involved, I believe, an indigenous community in Brazil. one of the key things that stands out, and I assume it will be the same here in the US context as well, is the issue of self-determination and acknowledgement of the sovereignty of indigenous communities and their nationhood. And so when it comes to relocation, it has to be something they want to do. And if they choose to also stay and, find ways to adapt in situ, I believe the government would need to respect their sovereignty and support them in that effort to stay, because relocating can be challenging to anyone. Anytime you move from where you have families and ties and connections and livelihood, it is challenging, not to talk of indigenous communities that had very special and peculiar ties to the land, to their ancestors that was in some cases are buried in the same land, and to think about also all of the special connections, not only to the land, but also their food sources, right? The kinds of food they eat, the kind of relationship they have with one another and with other indigenous communities. All of those things can be threatened when people are asked to relocate. And so that's why for me, in the paper, we did talk about the need to center people's not just their agency, but their self-determination in choosing the adaptation they believe will work best for them.
So shifting to the non-human world, you were mentioning the implications not just on human societies, but on non-human actors. A question is around what are the ethical or justice implications of relocating, reclaiming, adapting wastewater treatment plants, power plants that are at risk from sea level rise or other multiple coastal hazards? Do you see justice intersections between these climatopias and the coastal adaptation projects, and what barriers might exist when it comes to cleaning up toxic coastal sites and or relocating or adapting critical infrastructure?
Yeah. Oh my God. I don't know who asked that question, but could there be a more simpler question? That's a tough one. Oh my God. Yeah. Oh, so I've been thinking a lot about this issue. I'm not an expert on non-human justice dimensions, but in the paper we wrote, I did talk about the issue of ecological justice, right? And so when we think about, I'm just thinking about some of the work that I have done, but also some of my readings around this whole issue of climatopias. One of the concerns that I get is, I don't know if you may have seen this on TV as well, where you see a bunch of, fisheries just come out of the ocean, they're dead. Concerns around whale, dead. Turtles coming out dead. There's so many things we're seeing, and we don't even know. They'll tell you, we don't know why. We're just seeing a lot of these animals come offshore and they're dead. You see coral reefs that are bleached, right? So there are all of those changes that are happening. I'm not a biologist, so I haven't studied the ocean in that way. But from reading, we're seeing a lot of these impacts, even when we don't have those climatopias advanced that much. We're just seeing a tip of the iceberg when it comes to the climatopia starting. And there is this race for many countries to want to do the same thing. And if we do that, we relocate to living on the ocean, we relocate our infrastructure to the ocean, our water waste management, we're likely to see a lot of those, dead fishes more and more, which is not in our interest, but it's certainly not in the interest of future generations. And it's not in the interest of the species, because this earth is not only for humans. That's how I see it. And my daughter always reminds me about it. Anytime we're going around, she's always concerned about the birds or any animal. She sees a dead animal, like, why did that animal die? And there's a lot we are doing as humans to actually deplete biodiversity, and we need to find ways to stop doing that. And I don't see these climatopias as any form or shape helping, whether they are sustainable or whatever. I think advancing into the ocean is going to have some effect, if not severe effects, on biodiversity. And just from the IUCN reports that I was reviewing recently, the report actually suggested that maybe 1 in 4 species might be going extinct very soon, ocean species, marine life, right? So there are a lot of papers that are out there looking at biodiversity losses and how fast those losses are happening, and also the implications for humans, but also what we could do about it. So anyone interested in those types of analysis can actually look at the IUCN report and see that already we have a lot of negative effect on the ocean. And I'm just concerned, like the person who asked this question, that moving into the ocean and moving our infrastructure into the ocean could create more impact on those wildlife on the ocean as well, or marine lives on the ocean.
Thank you, Jola. Another question related to that is a local issue here, as we have offshore wind lease area established off of our Humboldt coast, and lease sales executed by the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, purchased by multinational corporations. And the question is just whether you see these floating offshore wind lease areas as a climatopia, or is it something different? And can you distinguish if there's a difference in your mind, and particularly with respect to these justice questions that you have?
For me, I don't see them as necessarily the same. I think they are different. Whether you're thinking about offshore solar panels that have been, constructed on the ocean, or the wind panels. And one of my major concerns, especially the justice side of it, is that where you are having those farms, the solar farms or wind farms, where you're producing them and who is going to be benefiting from them are two different locations oftentimes. And so the impact on the local community and on the local ocean area and the biodiversity there is something I think a lot of researchers need to be working on to really show whether or not there are significant, rationally you would expect there will be impact. Whatever we do as humans, there's always some impact, right? The question becomes, to what extent, what will be the degree of the losses that we're likely to see when it comes to impact on marine lives and impact on the ocean itself, the quality of the ocean, and whether or not there will be residues of these wind turbines over time, or even solar panels over time. Would there be any of these particles ending up in an ocean, and what would happen to the ocean in the long term? I honestly don't know yet. I think time will tell. So there is that dimension of the geography of where the production is happening and where they are being used. And then for the climatopias, they are different in the sense that, they are being constructed where people want to live, and whoever wants to live there anyway. They are constructed in the same waters, and they also will be using the stories that they will be using or harnessing wind and solar power, certainly. So how that is going to turn out ultimately, we'll wait and see. But from just a rational perspective, I think there will be some impact, but the degree of the impact is open to research.
Thank you. I think we have two more questions, and then we'll close it out if that sounds good to you, Jola. Yes. One is local and one is global. The first is a colleague's question. Humboldt Bay locally here is experiencing the fastest rate of sea level rise, relative sea level rise in California. Her question is, what advice would you give to local government planners and practitioners into how to approach conversations and planning around sea level rise adaptation with residents of low-lying areas? And what are practical ways they can bring equity and justice lens to this planning?
Big question. I think some of the answers are already embedded in the question. By that, I think, thinking about bringing communities together, to be honest, I don't see myself as someone that has the solution to what we should be doing. I believe people will live on the coast. People will live where this is happening. They understand those areas far better. Some of them have had generations of their family live here, and they're seeing those changes happening. And so bringing multiple voices together, bringing different planners, bringing multiple disciplines as well, right? So we do need the architects, but the point is, could they be building differently and not on the ocean, right? We need the adaptation practitioners. We need, people working in social services. We need all kinds of people to come together to kind of think through what we really need to do. I don't have the solutions. I do know that in some cases, relocation has worked where people are moved away because of, those severe impact. They're losing, not only is their home getting flooded every year, but they're also losing their properties. You have to replace everything. And so for some groups of people, moving to a place that is higher ground within the city, that is further away from the water has worked. And there are papers that do suggest that people were happy, even especially after Superstorm Sandy. There are evidence in New York, paper written by Liz Kozov and others, showing that people people who relocated some years after said they were glad they did. So that's one option that worked. But there might be several other options out there for communities, and it's left for people to come together and figure out what would work for one community may not necessarily work for another. And it's to think through what would work. I'm not suggesting that, building seawalls, we've seen the problems with seawalls, but I am partially in favor of, the amphibious designs. Again, we're yet to see how that will play out, but I'm sure there are lots of things, lots of options out there, adaptation measures that we need to think about and kind of think through also the cost to different people, right? If you're relocating, who is allowed to stay and who will be losing the value for their land if they move away from that coast, because the coast is very valuable. It's a lot of money. And so there are those dimensions that we need to think about, the equity issue. If everybody's leaving the coast, then let everybody leave the coast, not just people who are low income groups. So we need to think about those issues as well, but also think about support for people who may want to leave and who may find a safer haven somewhere else.
Thank you. Okay, our last question is around the lack of global guidelines for floating climate utopias or climatopias. And if you were on the UN committee asking for guidelines to suggest for the just and equitable implementation of floating climatopias, what would be one or two guidelines that you would put forth?
Your audience are too brilliant. Oh my God, that's such a brilliant question. I think number one guideline for me, this might be an obvious one, right? So we need environmental impact assessments for any of this project at all. Some of them, in the case of Lagos, the impact assessment was done after the project already started. And so that's a problem. So I think we do need to do those impact assessments for all of the projects. But the other dimension would be we need to also engage the communities that live on the coast. A lot of this project that I've seen, whether it's floating or reclamation-based project, I haven't really seen anyone that engaged the community. What I've seen is that, the planners or architects come in and say, this is the solution, and they start implementing it. And then afterward, they say, oh, it's going to benefit the community. But the point is, did you engage a fisherman that was fishing there or that has been fishing there for years? Did you engage the coastal communities that this is their livelihood, essentially? If you build this floating project, are they going to be able to live here? What happens to them? Many of those projects that I've shown you today, I haven't seen any of them engage community. And I think that will be another criteria for any project before it can go forward, apart from the technical environmental impact assessment. Did the community engage? Was there community buy-in? So there's something to engage a community. There's other one to say, yes, they said, let's do this. So that's another thing to think about. And then there's also the need to think about, what I mentioned earlier about path dependency. If we create those projects, are they going to be hard for us in the long term? Let's say there's a major tsunami or we're seeing more frequent storms or hurricanes or whatever. Are we able to pack all of those materials and leave? Or we will be stuck trying to spend more adaptation dollars to keep people in place. So that's something I think doing those analysis will be important, but also doing the scientific study about the impact on the ocean itself, on coral reefs, on all the marina. So there are tons, I think there are multi-layered assessments that I would recommend if I was in the UN panel looking into this issue. But another thing I think will be helpful is also to be mindful of the regional differences of, even though we have, the whole ocean of the world is connected, there are regional differences in terms of how this plays out, the level of sea level rise we may expect in different locations. Some locations may experience a higher sea level rise like Maldives. Some others might just be, 20 centimeters of sea level rise. That would play into what people do or do not do in terms of whether they support climatopias. And what else? There's so many things I've been thinking about what we should do. Let me see. What else would I suggest? Yeah, and then the truth is also to determine who exactly will be living in this project, right? So from what I see, a lot of those projects, quite frankly, are tailored to transnational capitalists. Whoever can bring in money, you can get a spot there. So if that's the case, is it really going to be benefiting the local community, or is it just another way to just open the door in a particular country for people who are wealthy, who already have a home somewhere, but then it becomes either their investment home or their second housing vacation home? So there are all of those dimensions I think we haven't really addressed in the literature, and that needs to be addressed. And certainly at the UN level, we do need those guidelines. We may be early in thinking about it, but we do need to think about it. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think the question that I'm left with was the one you asked earlier, which was whose vision of the world do we live in, or whose visions of the world do we listen to and then live inside of? So I think it's translating that singular vision into a multiple vision, and I thank you for helping us see so many more visions of the future than the ones that are presented. So thank you for your brilliant lecture and your wonderful answers to our questions, and for sharing your ideas and your work with our audience. We're so grateful and honored to have you with us this evening. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us. I'm going to post a link in the chat to the YouTube channel. Schatz Energy Research Center has a YouTube channel where you can go approximately in 1 week to view this talk or to share it with friends or others who you think might be interested. And again, just wishing you all a wonderful evening, and a wonderful thank you to Jola for her presentation this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everyone. And bye.